Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be sharing the process of making my wedding dress out of some thrifted fabric and curtains. This was a really special project for me, and despite a couple of mishaps along the way, I really love how it turned out, and so I hope that you find this video both informative as well as inspiring. I started filming this video on Tuesday, May 28th, and then I was married on July 6th, which meant that I had about 7 weeks left until my wedding. I had plans laid out to make my dress for several months, but I kept procrastinating because it felt like such a big project with so much pressure. But then I ended up just making a very simple linen backup dress, which I knew I would wear if this one didn't work out, and so that took away a lot of my stress, and I was finally able to get started. So for my dress, I am actually making two dresses. The first is a sheer gown that is based on a beautiful design by Cam Parrott, and the second is a simple slip to go underneath. So here I'm just sketching out the design and making a note of the patterns I'm going to be using, as well as any changes that I want to make. Starting with the supplies, here is my handy little bag of notions that I'd been collecting for this project. For the outer dress, I'm using the Butterick B6868 View B dress. I made the skirt longer, and I also changed the sleeves to lantern sleeves. I had originally planned to make them into raglan sleeves as well, but I ended up just leaving them as a set-in sleeve. For the fabric for this one, I'm using a pair of curtains that I got at the thrift store for $4 each. The fabric of the dress that this design is based on is a silk organza, and these curtains had a similar look and feel despite being made of polyester. I was worried that it wouldn't be very comfortable to wear, but it ended up being okay, especially with the slip dress underneath. And it was just really important to me that I keep this project as sustainable as possible, since I only plan to wear this dress once. For the slip dress, I used the Tessuti Sadie slip dress pattern, and I'm making it from this roll of satin fabric that I also thrifted. I've actually had this fabric in my stash for many years and always knew that I wanted to use it for my wedding dress even before we were engaged. It was only $8 for 5 meters, and I never knew the fabric composition, but it felt so soft and silky, so I ended up doing a burn test on it to try and find out what the fibers were. It ignited and went out quickly, smelled like burning hair, and didn't melt but left these little beads behind that crumbled to ash in my fingers, all of which indicated that it was made of pure silk. So this was definitely a very lucky thrift find and ended up being perfect for this project. I decided to start by making the slip dress, as it felt like the more approachable project of the two. The Tessuti pattern came with half pattern pieces that needed to be traced out on the fold to create the full piece. And instead of doing that on paper, I ended up using Illustrator to digitally trace the pattern pieces and reflect them, and then printed them out. Here I'm spreading my fabric out on the floor and trying to get it as straight as possible, which was hard since it was so slippery. And then I'm laying out my pattern pieces for cutting, and this is where my first mistake happened with this dress. Because my fabric was only 112 centimeters wide, it wasn't actually wide enough to fit the length of the dress when cut on the bias. So I shifted the pattern pieces slightly off bias so that they would fit, and I should have known that this wasn't a good idea because it resulted in the side seams of the dress twisting around my body when worn instead of hanging straight. But sometimes you just have to learn some lessons the hard way before they really sink in. I also knew that I had enough fabric to make a second dress if this one didn't turn out well, which we'll come back to later in this video. Once the main body pieces were cut, I used the scrap fabrics to cut out the facings and straps, which thankfully I could do on my cutting table. Next I moved on to assembling the facings, and here is where my second mistake with this dress came in. The instructions said to use a lightweight interfacing for the facings as well as a tearaway stabilizer for the neckline of the dress, and I decided to skip those because I didn't want any added bulk or weight around the neckline of the dress. This really only applies to the interfacing, so I have no good excuse for not using the stabilizer at least, other than the fact that I wasn't really able to find any at my local fabric store before starting this project. So again, we'll come back to that later in the video. To finish the facings, I'm first pressing the side seams open and then turning the bottom edge towards the wrong side for a very narrow rolled hem. Next, I moved on to the straps. These are folded right sides together and sewn, then turned right side out to create a very skinny rouleau strap. Instead of pressing them, I pinned them to my ironing board, making sure to stretch them out, and then used the steam from my iron to set them in place and allowed them to dry. This was my first time making rouleau straps, so they're not perfect and they came out a little bit bumpy. My tips would be to try and sew as straight a line as possible and also trim the seam allowance down before turning them out. Next, I'm working on the side seams of the dress. These are finished with French seams, so I'm first pinning the front and back with wrong sides together and stitching, and then I trimmed and pressed the seams and sewed them again with right sides together to create my French seams. Then I had to attach the facings, and this was a bit tricky because I also had to adjust and attach the straps at the same time, making sure that they were the right length for me. So it took a bit of trial and error and lots of trying the dress on, but I ended up getting there in the end. Once everything was attached, I pressed the facings well and understitched the seam allowances as far as I could go in the corners. I then hung the dress up to let gravity do its work overnight before finishing the hem. You can see a little bit in the footage, but it was a lot more apparent when wearing the dress that the facings were rippling a little bit along where I'd stitched and were also turning out even though I had understitched them. But I left this dress for now and started working on the outer dress. For the outer dress, I started by reading through all of the instructions in detail so that I had a good idea of how it all came together. I wanted to do French seams for this dress as well, and the pattern already included 1.5 centimeter seam allowances, which was great. Instead of cutting into the tissue pattern, I traced out all of the pattern pieces I would need so that I could make adjustments to them without ruining the original pattern, and I normally like to trace out paper patterns anyway, just so that I know they can be reused in the future. Next, I worked on making all of the adjustments that I wanted to the pattern, including lengthening the skirt and changing the sleeve from a sort of gathered balloon shape to a lantern sleeve. For the skirt, I ended up adding about 15 inches to the bottom of the dress from the hemline, keeping the angles of the lines so that it also added some fullness to the bottom of the skirt. To draft the lantern sleeve, I used a tutorial that I found online from Threads magazine, and I will link that in the description below. I started out by trying to do this on paper, but it was really difficult for me. I'm used to drafting patterns digitally, and I was also trying to make multiple adjustments at once instead of doing it step by step to save on my tracing paper. It was really fiddly and difficult to get the measurements right until I remembered that I could do this part digitally. So I took the measurements and drafted it in Illustrator instead, which was much easier and faster. And these are the pieces that I ended up with: a top sleeve, a bottom sleeve, and a facing for the sleeve cuff. Before cutting into my actual fabric, I decided to make a muslin of the bodice and sleeve to test it first and make sure that it all fit and came together well. Luckily, I was happy with the muslin on the first try, and so I went ahead with cutting out the dress. Moving on to construction, the first step of this dress was to sew the edges along the back bodice pieces that will create the open back of the dress. I turned the edges in twice to the wrong side, pressed them, and then edge stitched them down. Next, I attached the front and back bodice pieces at the shoulders, making sure to stitch them with wrong sides together first for my French seams. I then moved on to the collar, and I think I'm missing a bit of footage here because I don't have any of me actually attaching it, but I first stitched the collar pieces together, turned them right sides out, and then attached one side to the right side of my bodice. I then turned it to the inside and hand stitched along the collar edge from the wrong side, making sure to catch the folded edge and stitch along the previous stitch line as I sewed. And I did this by hand because it was much more precise than doing it on the machine, especially with this fabric, and it made sure that it wasn't visible from the right side. Next, I'm working on assembling the lantern sleeves. So first I sewed the sides of both the upper and lower sleeve pieces together using French seams, and then I attached those two pieces together using yet another French seam. And what was nice about this was it gave the sleeve a lot of structure, so it kept the lantern shape really well. And then lastly, I attached the cuff facing, which I actually ended up turning into more of a binding instead. After that, my sleeves were ready to attach to the bodice at the shoulders with, you guessed it, another French seam. I put in some basting stitches to help gather the sleeve head so that I could fit it into the arm side without too much puckering. Now moving on to the lower half of the dress, the first step was to install the invisible zipper at the center back. This was my first time doing an invisible zipper, and I did look up a tutorial beforehand for doing this with a French seam. Even still, I ended up being able to see a lot of the zipper from the right side, which is definitely not what we want with an invisible zip. So I asked on Instagram and got a lot of great tips, one of which was to roll the zipper teeth out of the way while sewing to get as close to them as possible. So I did another pass of stitching later on with this in mind, and it worked out a lot better. With the zipper installed, I just had to attach the rest of the skirt panels together using French seams. There were 7 skirt panels in total, and they were quite long, so this took a while, but it was also nice just to focus on a repetitive task while listening to an audiobook. I remember on this day I was so close to finishing the dress, and I was really excited to see it all come together, so I worked a bit later than usual, as you can tell by the change in lighting. I attached the skirt panels to the bodice, which was thankfully the final French seam of this project, gave it a good press, and then this dress was mostly done aside from some final touches. The last few steps to finish this dress were to install a hook and eye closure for the top of the zipper, some pearl buttons and button loops for the collar, both of which I did by hand, and finally hemming the skirt. At this point I still had a couple of weeks left until the big day, so I decided to revisit the slip dress. I wasn't 100% happy with it, and even though it was mostly hidden under the sheer outer dress, I wanted to see if I could try and make it better. The first thing I tried was adding some hem tape to stop the facing from turning out, which actually just made it worse. So in an attempt to salvage this dress, I decided to cut along the neckline, removing the previous facing and attaching a new one, this time using the proper stabilizer and interfacing. For the interfacing, I grabbed a piece of scrap fabric that would fit both of my facing pieces, then cut a piece of interfacing in the same size and ironed it to the scrap fabric before cutting the pieces out. This is a much less finicky way of adding interfacing, especially to smaller pieces like this, although it does waste a bit more of your interfacing than cutting them separately. Here I'm attaching the new facing pieces back onto the stabilized neckline, and I found that clips were actually a much better thing to use for this than pins, so that I wasn't creating holes in my fabric. Better late than never. And after I sewed them together, I tore away the stabilizer, which was very tedious because it came away in such small pieces. But from then on, I followed the same steps of understitching my facing to the seam allowance and giving everything a good press. So doing this did improve things, however the neckline still wasn't perfect, and the twisting of the side seams around my body due to the way that I had cut the pieces was also bothering me and wasn't really something I could fix. So in the end, I decided to remake the dress entirely, shortening the length so that I could cut it properly aligned on the bias and saving the other dress to use as remnants for another project. I also sized down one size to a small after comparing the finished measurements to a ready-to-wear slip dress in my closet. Because it was so close to the date and I was getting a bit stressed at this point, I didn't film any of the process for the second dress. However, all of the steps were exactly the same as what I showed here. And in the end, I was actually a lot happier with my second slip dress because I had learned so much from doing it the first time around. My rouleau straps turned out much better this time, and it was just such an important occasion that I think making the dress again so that I was happy with it was worth it in the end. So of course the day of our wedding was such a whirlwind and it completely missed me to take some video footage of the dress. So all I have are photos, but anyway, here is how the dress, or dresses I suppose, turned out. I feel like it's really close to how I envisioned it, and it was really light and comfortable to wear on a warm summer day. We honestly had such a good day surrounded by our family and friends and felt very loved.